quite a friendly atmosphere, I would say. Who is with the name? Um, so, dear Haonan, good afternoon. By us in Uzbekistan, you came to the next series of the Silk Road podcast, Silk Road Revival podcast series. Our guest today is Haonan Zhou. So he's an assistant professor of finance at Hong Kong University Business School. He studies international finance and macro, how exchange rates, global risk, and dollar funding shape real economies. Before Hong Kong University, he earned his PhD of economics at Princeton and worked with institutions like IMF and BIS. And he has prior work on covered interest parity deviations, and dollar funding stress. So our agenda today will consist of three parts. In the first part, we'll ask you some personal and work-related questions to get to know you and your works better. In the second part, we will specifically focus on one of your research works, which is the global dollar cycle. And in the third part, we will speak about another one of your research works, which is the fickle and the stable global financial cycle, transmission via heterogeneous investors. So that's basically it. Really glad that you joined us. Thanks for your time and your contribution as well. So, Haonan, I wanted to ask, is it okay if we record the meeting to later post it on our socials?
Okay, yeah, sure.
All right, that's great. Um, I guess we can move on to the part one now. So, my first question would be, what first drew you to the field of economics? Was there some open eyes moment that made you think that this is what you want to be doing for the rest of your life? Like the numbers, I mean, like the study of numbers.
Yeah, so yeah, I guess this is a good question. Well, back in the days, like during high school, I was probably just having nothing to do and like, okay, economics sounds interesting and exciting. I was probably just work, right? And then my undergraduate was at Chicago. So Chicago is a place pretty much known for like these relatively advanced way of teaching economics. I was kind of drawn to this, and then I was just taking classes, and I was kind of getting a little bit of a different impression than I get from like reading these relatively intro level textbooks, which is that the economics at U Chicago was pretty quantitative, and it started off teaching you a lot of basic methodology in terms of how you set up a model to think of the society and the economy. So this is something that I was a little bit surprised about, but eventually I find it seems to be a pretty powerful way of understanding the economy. So at least it gives people like it instills a sense of formal logic in terms of how you move from this piece to the next piece, trying to sort of incorporate all pieces together, especially when you think about the macroeconomy. So that's kind of how I first get drawn to sort of the economic research and how you think about like doing a little bit of a higher level classes and also research on economics. But then that's basically how it goes. And like the IMF experience is very useful because it sort of gives me a sense of, what are some of the most pressing questions that people in the policy world are really interested in. Right? So this is something that you cannot really get from, let's say, doing research with a professor at a university because they are super focused on their relatively narrow research questions. But in a policy environment, if you go outside, you will be able to at least get exposed to a lot of different things. And that I think is really useful. It sort of helped me sort of calibrate my research interest to the field of international finance and international macro. And mostly because of this experience. And that's also kind of how it sort of also drove how I try to approach research. I want to basically try to do research, but I want to start research project because I think the question itself is potentially going to be important. That's kind of how I assess the potential of a research.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot.
very
Pretty interesting.
interesting. So my next question would be like a follow-up question. So you studied at, you said like U Chicago,
Mhm.
then Princeton, and became a professor at Hong Kong University Business School, right? So, what changed most in how do you do research, like, and how do you approach research questions?
Yeah, so in terms of like the shifts, I think back in my undergraduate years, I'm pretty much still in a sort of like a formation stage in terms of how I would think of research. I don't really know what I want to do essentially in terms of like the actual research topics and stuff. So it's more of a trial and error, trying to replicate what people have done, stuff like that. But then Princeton was a place where you have a lot of freedom in terms of pursuing your own question of interest, and that's how some of the research that we are going to talk about later kind of flows into the surface. The idea is more of trying to really you have a lot of time to sort of figure out what is the number one research question that really interests you. So that's kind of like uh, kind of the defining feature of like doing a PhD. You have like 5 or 6 years to be able to center it around one or two topics and just work on it. So this is kind of like the PhD years of the research. But once you started off as a assistant professor, once you start with kind of like a tenure track, then you have to sort of balance a lot of different things. Like doing research nowadays, of course, you still have to work on something that truly interests you. Try to sort of make you sort of stay up late, try to get something done. But you also have to sort of balance with like the process of publication, and also you have to make sure that because time is kind of limited. So when you're doing research, you have to really structure your time. You also have to make sure that are on top of different projects, and you kind of at some point you have to do a little bit multitasking, which is not necessarily going to be the case when you were a PhD because you are able to focus on the one or two particular papers. But now I have to juggle through a lot of different projects, oftentimes spanning different areas. So, this is completely different experience, I would say. But ultimately, I still think like you need to have a little bit of inherent interest in everything that you do. So if you're not interested in any of the projects, then even if the project is going to end up like publishing super well, I don't think it's going to be a great experience for you when you're working on this. So that's still something that I try to adhere to as much as possible.
Got it.
Our next question about like how to choose a paper, how you choose a paper. But all right, so beyond publications, many professors measure their impact through their students' success. So, can you share an example of a former student whose work or past surprised and delighted you? And is it like the main like source of sort of motivation to work for you, that like the success of your students?
Yeah, so I'm definitely not necessarily going to be the best person to ask this question because I'm still relatively early in my in my career, and we don't have a lot of like direct student professor relationship at this point, especially for PhD students. So the cycle of producing a PhD is oftentimes going to be relatively long. But I would just say two things. One thing is that I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of PhD students at Hong Kong U, and I think they're pretty aspirational, and they also have a lot of skills in terms of the actual hard skills in terms of doing research. So what they really what we really want to create for them was basically like visibility in the sense that Hong Kong is a place where we are able to sort of invite a lot of people over for conferences, for seminars. But then I think for the students, they also will need to sort of talk to the leading scholars in their field and also potentially talk to sort of create some chance for them to also sort of visit other universities to be able to sort of get this conversation a little bit deeper. So this is something that we are trying to achieve. And the other thing I just want to say is just, I think I'm pretty much influenced by my advisor back in Princeton, the way he approached research and also the way he sort of advises students. I think I think two things that I really believe in after I sort of spent like 3-4 years working with him was, by the way, his name is Mark Aguiar. He's a professor at Princeton. His way of approaching a problem is a research is basically just very simple. Just ask the right question and answer it. Right. So this is very important because for a lot of students that I saw, they're very worried about not being able to sort of get started. So once they might be able to ask a very good question, like a research question, but then they just enter into like a self-doubt mode because they're basically just start worrying a lot about whether I can answer this question. Is there any sort of concern about this project? And without actually starting to work on it. So I think the idea is that the thing I got from my advice is that you really have to be practical. Really need to get on working. You really need to get your hands dirty on a project instead of just basically brushing around the bush. Just come up with an idea and just start thinking about it like randomly without actually sort of working on anything. So this is one thing that really affects me a lot. And the second thing is just that he's always kind of chill. I think you need to sort of you need to at least give you some sort of like positive sort of mental feedback as you move along the research process. This is also how I try to give advice to students. I'm not the type to sort of like dunk on like a student's idea because I think research is always like an iterative process. So even if like the first stage or like the early idea may sound a little bit crude, it might have the potential to be able to develop into like a good research under some intervention. So my advising style is always a little bit more constructive rather than destructive. But I think sometimes you might come across some advisors who are a little bit harsh. I don't think that's an issue. I think for a lot of people, you need to get honest, harsh feedback in order to sort of recalibrate your research direction. But for me, I feel like a lot of times you don't want to go into the other extreme where you know you're having a good idea, admittedly a little bit crude in the first place, but then someone just gives you a lot of negative feedback so that you are discouraged. I don't want to do this. So that's kind of his advising style that I sort of inherited that I'm potentially going to apply to more of the students going forward.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. And my next question would be about more about finance. So in your paper of the global
Yeah.
dollar cycle, what is like some of the lessons that you want like emerging and developing economies to learn about, and when the dollar suddenly like jumps?
Yeah, so this is a great question because I think this is probably one of the most sort of policy relevant piece I've ever written. And so I want to sort of take a step back and just think about the broad background for emerging markets like Uzbekistan or like a typical large economy like Brazil or Chile. So what happens usually is that they're pretty much subject to sort of external shocks and potentially through multiple channels, trade, finance, capital flows, and so on. What we try to uncover in the paper is to what extent certain global factors could potentially predict the business cycles of emerging markets. And it seems that dollar fluctuations, the strength of the dollar overall, seems to be a pretty good indicator of what's next for emerging markets. So if I were to suggest like one like very immediate lesson for the countries is that we really need to we can potentially have some space for having the dollar index as a tool to forecast what is going to happen to emerging markets. This is a pretty good indicator that should be in the toolkit of central banks, research firms, and monetary authorities, fiscal authorities, and so on. So that's a very immediate possibility of some of the specific transmission mechanism associated with sort of dollar fluctuations. And I think some of the lessons associated with this is that dollarization is something that is not necessarily very desirable. When I say dollarization, I mean all sorts of dollarization. I mean, to what extent your firms and the governments finance yourselves using dollars, which is prevalent in the case of emerging markets. And also, to what extent is the payment system built on dollars? Are a lot of the international trade invoiced in dollars? So these type of dollarization could, in principle, affect a lot about the strength of the transmission of dollar shocks to emerging market. Suppose a very apparent transmission mechanism will be, suppose the firm is heavily indebted in dollars. Then when the dollar appreciates, the real borrowing cost and the real debt burden of that firm is going to rise accordingly. And as a result, they're going to be thrown into all sorts of trouble when it comes to debt repayment. And that's going to be contractionary from the economy standpoint. So these type of configurations of the economy when it comes to sort of the balance sheet structure, sort of the overall exposure to U.S. dollars is something that policymakers should be mindful about. And I want to talk about this just because I think dollarization used to be a big problem for a lot of countries. It seems to sort of the relevance of it seems to sort of go down in sort of the 2000s, but I think it's going to make a comeback because now there's a lot of voices about developing stable coins in the sort of financial system, right? So it used to be mostly like a niche thing for the DeFi world, but now it's making its steps into the traditional financial system. A lot of different actors are going to use stable coins, especially in countries. This is an usual observation, especially in countries for which the monetary discipline is relatively weak, the overall exchange rate is subject to a lot of fluctuations, inflation is particularly volatile. In countries like these, there seems to be a lot of impetus for adopting stable coins denominated in another currency. So my understanding and my projections about the future for emerging market is that emerging market has to be super mindful about the trend of dollarization making a comeback through the use of stable coins in the payment system, as well as stable coins especially stable coins denominated in US dollars in the financial system. So in that sense, I think that the relevance of dollarization is going to be uh, even stronger in the future with these type of financial innovations. And a lot of the lessons coming from the dollar cycle paper is going to be relevant again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So my next question, dear professor, would be about balancing the research and teaching. So how do you balance the demands of producing good quality research with the equally big responsibility of teaching the students? And what is more important to you personally, teaching the already known or exploring the unknown?
Yeah, so this is a great question actually, because this is something that, I think every tenure track professor is going to ask him or herself. Just because it's always a little bit of you could think of this as a little bit of a trade-off because teaching does occupy a lot of your time as a professional, but what matters for in terms of thinking about promotion and also thinking about establishing yourself in academia as a research track faculty is going to be through research. So this is always kind of like a tricky thing to manage. But I think one thing that I got from teaching for 2 semester on for undergraduates on a class called Capital Markets and Institutions is that I do think there is a little bit of point of contact between research and teaching, because something that I've done are going to be sort of based on financial institutions, based on the markets. And I can always talk to them about some of the research I've been doing that is relevant for the class. So there's a little bit of a synergy going on. But also, on the other hand, I think teaching is also a way for me to sort of also get up to date about what's happening in the market, because I essentially teach financial markets institutions. So for the students, I think I have to sort of also get up to date on what the market is looking like, so that I can actually give them a sense of why the concepts and the methodology that is being taught in class are relevant for you to think about real world phenomena. So this is going to be potentially constituting a good feedback for my research, because most of my research are going to be grounded in reality, right? Grounded in what's recently happening in the financial system and the financial markets as a whole. So I try to see if there's a little bit of synergy between these two. Teaching informs what I want to do as a research topic, and also research informs what I want to potentially teach the students. That's kind of like a general kind of guideline that I try to adhere to. But overall, I think the idea is that I've been teaching undergraduates, so when it comes to like actually sort of getting to the technical aspect of research, I don't think there is any sort of overlap. But it's more of a conceptual thing. But overall, I think this is something that I find useful. And the other thing is just, you do need to achieve a little bit of balance. So there could be a little bit of a shortcuts that you can take, because these kind of classes are oftentimes, structured relatively standard in a standard way, so that you don't necessarily have to worry too much about developing your own curriculum. Of course, I think having a little bit of up-to-date material, having a little bit of curriculum that is that you really want to teach your students is great. So what I do is I mostly inherit what other people have been doing, but then I try to insert my own influence by incorporating research that I'm mostly familiar with, and also having a little bit more presence of the topics that I do research on. For instance, in my versions of the class, relative to other people, I will focus a little bit more on like the foreign exchange market, focus a little bit more on the international financial system, something that I'm mostly familiar with. So from a standpoint of preparing for the class, it's a little bit more cost efficient for me. But I think it's also okay, because like the students do want to hear about the foreign exchange market, especially under the circumstance of Hong Kong, which is a global financial center. I think students have the demand, so I just want to basically meet the demand by supplying them with something that I know relatively better compared to other topics.